People sometimes ask me, now, how a woman who spent 12 years investigating fraud for the United States Army could have missed what was happening in her own house for 6 of them. I used to have a defensive answer ready. These days, I just tell them the truth. I didn't miss it. I minimized it on purpose, one small justification at a time, because the alternative meant admitting that the life I had built to make someone else comfortable was quietly costing me everything I actually was. This is the story of the year that stopped being sustainable. The year I finally let myself be seen again, in full, rank and all, and the year I learned that walking away from harm isn't cruelty. It's arithmetic. It's simply refusing to let the debt keep compounding. I didn't cry when Marcus's hand struck my face. That surprised even me in the half-second before the pain arrived, the way it surprised the room, the way it surprised Sophie, whose scream came a full beat after the sound of the slap itself. As if her small body needed that extra moment to understand what she had just watched her father do. The sound echoed through the dining room of our house in McLean, sharp and flat, like a door slamming somewhere far away. My cheek burned, but the burn felt distant, almost polite, compared to the cold that was spreading through my chest. I had felt worse pain in worse places. Places with no name on a map. Places where the person doing the hurting, at least, had the decency to be a stranger. This was not the worst thing that had ever happened to me. It was only the worst thing that had happened to me in this particular life, the one where I had spent 6 years pretending to be someone smaller than I actually was. 3 hours earlier, I had been at the Ritz-Carlton in Tyson's Corner on my knees on a hotel ballroom carpet, arranging pink balloons into an arch over a table set for 12 small chairs. A fondant cake shaped like a castle balanced carefully at its center. Sophie had picked out the theme herself. Princesses, but warrior princesses, Mommy? The kind with swords. And I remember feeling, for one uncomplicated hour, something close to happiness. Marcus had promised to clear his calendar for the entire afternoon. He had promised a great many things over the years I'd been his wife, and I had gotten very good at pretending the promises mattered more than his habit of breaking them. When he finally arrived, he didn't come alone. He came with Vanessa Cole, his executive assistant of 4 years. Her eyes red-rimmed, her hands trembling around a shredded evening gown, the same custom gown he had given her last month, the one he called a thank you for saving his life in a car accident 6 years earlier. It was meant to be her dress for the company's fall gala. She cut it, Vanessa said, her voice breaking exactly on cue, exactly the way it always broke when she needed a room full of adults to believe her over a 5-year-old. Sophie cut it. I found her holding the scissors. I hadn't even opened my mouth to answer before Marcus's hand came across my face. The cake table went over with me. Frosting and shattered fondant swords scattered across the carpet, and Sophie, my daughter 5 years old today, wearing a brand new tulle dress she had chosen because it had a cape sewn into the back, screamed and ran to grab my leg. "Take her to my mother's," Marcus told the driver waiting by the door, not even glancing down at his own daughter clinging to my knees. "I'm going to deal with her mother." Sophie fought free of the driver's grip and threw herself at Marcus instead, biting down on his leg with the ferocity only a frightened child can manage. He shoved her back without looking the way you'd shove aside a piece of furniture blocking a doorway, and she hit the edge of the console table hard enough that blood immediately welled up along her hairline, bright and shocking against her pale skin. Sophie. I got to her before I even registered moving, pulling her into my lap, pressing my sleeve to the cut. My hands were steady. That surprised me too. That was the part of me I had spent 6 years telling myself was retired. Major Elena Calloway, United States Army Criminal Investigation Division, Financial Crimes. The part that didn't panic. That cataloged injuries and exits and threats in the same clinical half-second, whether the scene was a warehouse full of stolen defense contracts or my own dining room floor. I had told myself when I married Marcus that I was retiring that woman. I had been wrong. She had simply been waiting. "Mr. Wade, your leg, you're bleeding," Vanessa said, rushing to dab at his trouser cuff with a scented handkerchief, her voice trembling with performed devotion. "It's my fault. I shouldn't have said anything about the dress. I don't deserve nice things anyway. I never should have accepted a gift like that." That sentence did exactly what it was engineered to do. Whatever flicker of doubt had crossed Marcus's face when he saw his daughter bleeding disappeared entirely. He looked down at me and Sophie on the floor, as if we were something unpleasant he'd stepped in on his way to somewhere important. "Look at what you've raised," he said. "A feral little animal. You'd manipulate a 5-year-old out of jealousy. You disgust me." I looked up at this man I had loved once, honestly, before I understood what loving him would cost me. 6 years ago, I had taken a leave of absence from active duty because he told me, gently at first, the way these things always start gently, that a wife whose rank outpaced his own ego wasn't the kind of wife he needed. I believed foolishly, the way people in love believe foolish things, that if I made myself smaller, if I folded myself down into someone he could feel superior to, he would eventually see the actual person I was and love her anyway. "I didn't cut the dress," I said. My voice came out steady, almost bored, the calm surprising even me. "Neither did Sophie. You didn't check the security footage. You didn't ask a single question before you hit me in front of our daughter." "Vanessa saved my life," Marcus said, like it was scripture recited from memory. "She has scars on her back from that accident. Are you seriously suggesting she cut up her own gift just to frame you?" The scars on her back. I closed my eyes for exactly 1 second. It was always this story. It had been this story for 6 years, and it was never going to stop being this story until someone made it stop. Carla, the housekeeper who had worked for us for 2 years and who I suspected had liked me a great deal more than she was ever permitted to say out loud, had already dialed 911 from the kitchen. I learned that afterward in the report. A patrol car actually came. I heard the radio chatter through the window while Marcus screamed at Carla to get back to the kitchen and mind her business. 2 officers stood in our foyer for 11 minutes. One recognized Marcus from a Rotary Club dinner. The other recognized the name on the mailbox, Wade, as in Wade Defense Solutions, as in the company that had underwritten last year's Policemen's Benevolent Association Gala, the one with the open bar and the raffle for a week at a lake house. They wrote something on a clipboard, told us both, evenly, to work it out at home, and left without so much as photographing the cut on Sophie's forehead. I understood in that moment, with a clarity sharper than anything I'd felt in years, exactly how alone the system was prepared to let me be, and exactly how much of that isolation had been purchased quietly. One charity dinner at a time, Marcus locked me and Sophie in the wine cellar that night. No food, no water beyond a half bottle I'd hidden in my coat pocket out of some old field instinct that never fully turns off, no matter how many years you spend pretending it has. No light, except a single dying wall sconce that buzzed faintly, like it too was exhausted. I sat against the cold stone with my daughter's head on my chest, and for the first time in 6 years I let myself remember, fully and without apology, exactly who I actually was. In the dark, I did the thing my training had drilled into me 1,000 times over. I documented. I used the cracked screen of my phone held low against my leg so the light wouldn't show under the door, and photographed the cut on Sophie's forehead, the mark forming along my cheekbone, the door with no interior handle. The empty water bottles Marcus had ordered removed. Evidence first, feelings later. That discipline had kept me steady through 2 deployments and a career of finding lies hidden inside spreadsheets. It would keep me steady now in a cellar built to hold 200 bottles of wine and, apparently, my dignity. "Mommy, it hurts," Sophie whispered, her small hands fisting in my torn collar. "I know, baby." I pressed my sleeve gently to her wound and tore a strip from my scarf to bandage it properly, my hands moving with the same care I'd once used on soldiers whose injuries were far worse and whose lives depended on my steadiness holding. "We're not staying here, I promise you that. Do you believe me?" She nodded against my chest, her breathing slowly evening out into something close to sleep. My own tears came later, quietly, not from the pain, but from something closer to grief. Grief for 6 years spent convincing myself that shrinking was the same thing as loving someone. I thought about the day I met Marcus at a fundraiser for a veterans housing initiative back when I still wore my uniform in public without flinching. Back when he told me my work sounded fascinating and asked question after question like he genuinely wanted to understand it. I had believed that man was real. Maybe, for one evening, he had been. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I hadn't dialed in 6 years, blocked so long the name almost looked unfamiliar. I hit call. It picked up on the first ring. "Elena?" My brother Nathaniel's voice, Colonel Nathaniel Calloway, United States Army, currently running Calloway Executive Protection, a State Department licensed close protection firm staffed almost entirely by veterans he'd served alongside, went from sleepy to razor alert in half a second. I heard him sit up in bed. Heard something crash to the floor, probably a lamp. "Where are you?" "Who did this?" "Nate." My voice came out cracked, but level, the way I'd been trained to deliver bad news without letting it collapse the person listening. "I need the family protocol activated. Sophie's hurt. I'm done being invisible." A long silence filled only with his breathing. "Copy that," he said finally in the flat command voice I hadn't heard him use since our cousin's husband raised his voice at his own wife at a Thanksgiving dinner years earlier. The same voice that had ended that conversation in about 4 seconds flat. "Hold tight." Morning came with the cellar doors swinging open, sunlight blinding after so many hours of dark. It wasn't Marcus. It was the house manager, a thin, nervous man named Preston, who had clearly drawn the short straw, holding a leather folder and a fountain pen on a silver tray, his face arranged into practiced neutrality. "Mr. Preston's neutrality. Wade says if you won't apologize to Miss Cole, you're to sign this," he said and set the tray in front of me without quite meeting my eyes. "Divorce agreement." The core clause was blunt, almost insultingly so. Wife found at fault for major marital misconduct. Forfeits all marital assets. Forfeits custody of the minor child. I almost laughed. Marcus had built an entire company on precision engineering and couldn't spot the most basic tactical error sitting directly in front of him. He had just handed me in writing a document that any competent attorney would recognize as the product of coercion the moment they saw the timestamp against my visible injuries. I stood wincing slightly as a bruise along my ribs pulled tight, and before I signed anything, I made sure my face, marked swollen, unmistakably injured, was framed clearly in the corner where I knew the house's own security system kept a camera. Then I signed. "Change the custody clause," I said, sliding it back across the tray. "I keep Sophie. I don't want a cent of his money. Not now, not ever. If he disagrees, we'll let a judge decide." Preston blinked, clearly not expecting decisiveness from a woman he'd been told, presumably, was broken. "I'll ask Mr. Wade." 10 minutes later, Marcus came down himself, suit immaculate despite the hour, Vanessa trailing behind with a water glass like a devoted nurse in a soap opera. "What game is this, Elena? You think you can survive a week out there with an injured kid and no money?" I looked past him toward the small high window at the gray sky beginning to spit rain. "It's going to rain," I said. "Whether I survive, that is my problem, not yours." He grabbed my wrist, hard enough to bruise, hard enough that I felt the old, familiar instinct to disarm him rise up through my arm before I consciously suppressed it. "The second you walk out that door, everything Wade is done with you. Don't come crawling back when the money runs out." I didn't flinch. I turned my head instead and looked at Vanessa, who was watching this exchange with poorly hidden satisfaction, already imagining herself standing in this kitchen in 6 months as its mistress. I raised my free hand and slapped her, once, clean and controlled, the way you deliver a strike you intend to be remembered. She shrieked and stumbled into the wall. "Marcus, are you going to let her?" "I'm not insane," I said before he could finish deciding whose side to take. "I'm awake." I picked Sophie up straight in my spine the way I hadn't in 6 years and walked out through the cellar, through the kitchen, past Carla, who caught my eye for one brief second and gave the smallest nod, out the front door into the rain. I didn't take an umbrella. I didn't take a coat. I only had my daughter, wrapped tight against my collarbone, and the cold October rain soaking straight through both of us within seconds. Nathaniel was already at the curb in a black Suburban engine running, hazards blinking through the downpour. He got out the moment he saw me, and the man who had once told me at 19 that crying was for people who hadn't trained hard enough had to visibly compose himself before he could speak. "Your brother's here," he said, voice rough, wrapping his own coat around Sophie and me both. "Let's go home." He didn't take me to a hospital, and I didn't ask him to. Public records meant a paper trail Marcus's lawyers could later spin into something unrecognizable, and I wasn't ready to hand him anything at all. Not even my own suffering. Instead, we drove 2 hours west to the Calloway family property outside Front Royal, where Nathaniel's old unit surgeon, Dr. Dink, Ada Isabello, a trauma physician who'd run a forward surgical team in Landstuhl for a decade before returning stateside, was waiting with a full field kit and, crucially, proper sedation and pain management. I let myself be treated the way I should have been treated from the very beginning. Sedated, examined, thoroughly documented with time-stamped photographs by a licensed physician whose notes would hold up in any court in the country. Should it come to that. Whoever did this, Dr. Bellows said quietly while she worked, cleaning a cut along my hairline I hadn't even noticed. Did it enough times that your body's flinching from muscle memory now, not just from tonight. I didn't answer that directly. In the next room, Sophie was already asleep, her small forehead properly bandaged, her breathing even and unhurried for the first time in 2 days. My father found me on the porch before I found him. Lieutenant General Robert Calloway, retired 11 years by then, still moved like a man who expected a room to come to attention when he entered it, though he'd softened enough in retirement to wear a cardigan over his undershirt without apparent shame. He didn't ask what happened. Nathaniel had clearly already told him everything on the drive up. He simply pulled a second chair beside mine and sat, silent, for a long time, watching the same darkening ridgeline I was watching. "Your mother used to tell me," he finally said, "that the day you stopped writing home about your work was the day she started worrying about you. You used to send pages, then it was a paragraph, then it was a holiday card." He paused. "I should have called and asked why, instead of assuming you were just busy." "I made it very easy to assume that," I said. "I wanted it to look easy." "That's the part I can't forgive myself for missing," he said. "Not what he did. What he did is on him and he'll answer for it. What I missed is on me. I trained soldiers for 30 years to recognize when someone under their command was quietly falling apart behind a competent face. I didn't recognize it in my own daughter." He reached over and took my hand, the way he hadn't done since I was small enough to need help crossing a street. "You don't have to make anything look easy in this house. Not ever again." That evening, I sat on the back porch with a mug of coffee I never drank, watching the Blue Ridge Mountains fade into silhouette against the last of the light, letting myself feel for the first time in 6 years, entirely and completely awake. I thought about all the versions of an apology I had accepted over the years, the flowers, the vacations, the jewelry that always arrived a day or two after a bruise had already started to fade, and I understood finally that I had not been in a marriage. I had been running a long, quiet negotiation with a man who had no intention of ever meeting me halfway, and I had mistaken my own exhaustion for patience. My other brother, Grant, Major Grant Calloway, Judge Advocate General's Corps, a military prosecutor whose conviction rate in defense fraud cases was practically a legend around the Pentagon's E-ring, arrived the next morning with a laptop bag and an expression I recognized from every deposition he'd ever prepped me for back when I still worked cases that occasionally crossed into his jurisdiction. "I need you to look at something," he said, sliding the laptop across the kitchen table, not even bothering with a greeting first, which was, in its own way, more comforting than any hug could have been. Wade Defense Solutions has an active contract with the Army for encrypted communications hardware. I've had a bad feeling about their quality assurance paperwork for close to 2 years. I never had grounds to push on it. Now I think I do. I opened the files with the same cold clarity I used to bring to a financial crimes case, the part of me that had spent a career finding the lie hiding inside a column of numbers. Within an hour, I found exactly what Grant's instincts had been circling for 2 years. Falsified certification records claiming military-grade components had passed testing they had never actually undergone. Cheaper, uncertified civilian parts, stamped and shipped as mil-spec, destined for equipment that soldiers in the field would eventually depend on to stay alive. That wasn't a marital dispute anymore, whatever it might have started as. That was a federal crime. False claims against the government of the United States, the exact kind of case the Defense Criminal Investigative Service exists to pursue. "This isn't revenge," I told Grant, watching his face carefully. "It's both," he said, not unkindly. "It just happens to also be entirely true." I filed the report through proper DCIS channels that same afternoon, fully aware that because I was a former spouse of the company's CEO, it would need a preliminary conflict of interest review before any action could be taken. Aware, too, that the wait itself would be its own particular kind of torment. My youngest brother, Derek, former Army intelligence, now running a well-regarded strategic communications firm in Alexandria, leaned against the kitchen counter reading over my shoulder, arms crossed. While the wheels turn, he said. I know a defense industry reporter at a major outlet who's been trying to get someone inside Wade Defense to talk on the record for over a year. I'm not hacking anything, and I'm not planting anything. I'm just going to make sure the right journalist is paying close attention on the day this becomes public record, the way it inevitably will. Do it clean, I said. Everything clean. That's the entire point of any of this. He nodded, already typing. The waiting was its own kind of discipline. DCIS assigned a senior special agent named Priya Anand to the case, and she called me twice that first week, once to confirm the chain of custody on the documents Grant had helped me organize, and once simply to ask, in a voice that sounded like she'd made this call more than a few times before, whether I was safe where I was staying. We move carefully on cases involving a former spouse, she told me. Not because we doubt you, because defense attorneys will spend a great deal of money trying to make this look like a vendetta instead of a federal crime, and I intend to hand them nothing to work with. I respected that more than I resented the delay. I had built my own career on the same principle, that the strength of a case lives or dies in the boredom of its paperwork, not in the drama of its accusations. While Agent Annan's team quietly built the technical case, Derek's contact at the paper spent 3 weeks independently confirming details through former Wade defense engineers willing to speak off the record, cross-referencing testing logs against shipment manifests, building a story that could stand entirely on its own even without a single word from me. I never once fed her a document directly. I didn't need to. The truth, once you stop protecting the person hiding it, tends to be remarkably easy for a competent reporter to find. 3 days later, I took Sophie to a children's boutique in Tyson's Corner, trying to give her something that felt normal. A plain sweater, an ordinary Saturday. She was standing at the window, pointing at a velvet dress with a sparkling collar, when I heard heels clicking sharply behind me, trailed by a wave of over-applied, expensive perfume. Well, well, Vanessa said, arms loaded with shopping bags, Marcus's black card visibly tucked into her open clutch. Look who's slumming it in the children's section. How does someone who left with absolutely nothing afford to even window shop here? Sophie shrank behind my legs, one small hand fisting in my skirt. I turned slowly and took off my sunglasses. Vanessa, I said, my voice flat, unhurried. It seems yesterday's slap didn't teach you anything about how to speak to people. She sneered and snapped her fingers at the young sales associate hovering nearby. Wrap up everything in this window. Every single piece. I want this woman's daughter to watch me buy the whole store with Marcus's money. The associate hesitated, glancing uncertainly at me because, as it happened, the boutique's parent holding company was one in which my father, retired Lieutenant General Robert Calloway, sat on the board due a family trust, a fact I had genuinely not planned to use but was not in this moment above using. Word travels quickly among people who owe each other favors. Within minutes, the store's regional manager appeared, apologizing profusely and by name, and quietly asked security to escort Vanessa and Marcus's card off the premises entirely. That card, I told the manager evenly, and anything tied to that account isn't welcome in any property my family holds an interest in, anywhere, ever. Vanessa's face shifted from smug to something close to genuine panic as 2 security guards took her firmly by the arms. You have no idea who you're dealing with, she hissed at me over her shoulder as they walked her out. No, I said quietly, kneeling to help Sophie try on the velvet dress. After all, you don't. That evening, Grant came back to Front Royal with a thick black case, his jag dress shirt still creased from a long day at the office. I pulled the accident report from 6 years ago, he said, setting 3 folders on the table. The one everyone remembers as Vanessa's fire. I sat very still, bracing for what I already half suspected. There was no fire, Grant said. It was a single-vehicle accident on Skyline Drive during a storm. Marcus's car went off the shoulder into a ravine. You were doing volunteer disaster relief coordination 2 miles away when the call came over the emergency band. You were first on scene off-duty, no jurisdiction at all. And you pulled him out of a burning engine compartment before the whole thing went up. Vanessa arrived afterward. She found your Army-class ring in the wreckage, the one engraved with your old unit designation, and she never gave it back. She told Marcus, and eventually everyone else, that she was the one who pulled him out. I remembered the ring. I remembered, distantly, how strange it had always felt that Marcus never once asked why my back carried a burn scar that never fully faded, why storms still made my shoulder ache years later. He never asked. I had let myself believe, for 6 years, that his silence on the subject meant trust. Now I understood it had simply never once occurred to him that I might be the hero in a story that wasn't primarily about him. "There's more," Grant said, sliding a second folder across the table. "Bank records. Marcus wired her almost $8 million over 6 years, all of it dressed up as gratitude. She laundered a chunk of it through shell accounts in the Caymans. And this," he opened a tablet and pressed play on a grainy clip from a hidden camera a housekeeper had installed months earlier after growing suspicious of missing items in the storage room. It showed Vanessa, alone, methodically cutting the gown to shreds with a small, satisfied smile on her face, then pinching her own forearm hard enough to leave a mark before forcing genuine-looking tears. I watched my own daughter's split forehead flash behind my eyes again. My hands closed into fists on the table before I made myself release them. "Intentional infliction of emotional distress, embezzlement, wire fraud, falsifying evidence in connection with a domestic incident," Grant said, ticking the items off with the same clinical calm he used in a courtroom. "Combined with what I've already got building on Wade defense, I could put her away for a very long time. And Marcus, if he personally signed off on any of those falsified certifications, tax exposure alone could bury him even without the fraud charges." "Not yet," I said. "I don't want him arrested first. I want him to understand exactly what he threw away with his own eyes before the government does its job for him." Grant studied me for a long moment, the way he used to study a witness he wasn't sure he trusted. "That's not vengeance talking." "No," I agreed. "It's a debrief. He's going to get the full picture, the way any officer deserves, before making his next decision. I just intend to be the one who delivers it." 3 days after that, DCIS formally opened an investigation into Wade Defense Solutions, and within the same week, banks that had financed Marcus's expansion began quietly declining to renew his credit lines, not through some dramatic overnight freeze, but through ordinary loan covenanters that had always given them the contractual right to pull funding the moment a federal fraud investigation touched a borrower. It was slower than fiction, and far more devastating for exactly that reason. Because there was no conspiracy for anyone to point to, no villain to blame beyond the paperwork he himself had signed, just contracts doing precisely what contracts are designed to do. Derek's reporter Contact published her story the same week the investigation became public record. Years of falsified military component certifications, a defense contractor's private jet and lake house purchased on the back of equipment that had never been properly tested. Wade Defense's private valuation, riding high on an expected initial public offering, collapsed almost overnight under the weight of canceled contracts and a board revolt led, fittingly, by Marcus's own uncle. I watched it happen from a careful distance, the way you watch weather roll in over mountains you already know well. The board meeting where they removed him ran less than 20 minutes, according to Derek, who had a source in the room by then. Marcus's own uncle, gray-haired and visibly exhausted, slid a single-page resolution across the conference table without preamble. 40 years this family spent building something real, he reportedly said. You had it 18 months and let a defense contract collapse because you couldn't keep your personal life out of the quality assurance office. Nobody in the room defended him. Several of the younger board members, engineers who had spent their careers actually building the hardware Marcus had been selling as something it wasn't, reportedly refused to even shake his hand on the way out. One of them saying flatly that soldiers had been carrying his company's radios into places where a failure meant somebody didn't come home. The board removed Marcus as CEO within 72 hours of the story breaking. He left the building through a service exit to avoid the photographers gathered out front, and even that indignity leaked within the hour, captured on someone's phone and uploaded before he'd even reached his car. That same week, he returned home to find Vanessa packing 2 suitcases stuffed with cash, jewelry, and whatever liquidity she'd managed to siphon before the accounts froze. He didn't call the police. He grabbed her by the arm, screaming that she had cost him everything he built, and when she tried to bolt for the door, he shoved her hard enough that she fell against the doorframe and split her lip open. She ran. He let her go, not out of any remaining mercy, but because he no longer had the strength left to chase anyone. I heard about it from Derek before it ever made the news. I felt nothing resembling satisfaction, only a kind of tired, professional confirmation, the way you feel when a threat assessment you filed months earlier finally proves accurate. Vanessa didn't run far. Desperate cut off for Marcus's money, for the first time in years, tracked increasingly by her own poor decisions, she made one final catastrophic choice. She reached out to a small-time contact she'd used once before to move stolen goods. A man who went by Scarface, and exactly the kind of low-rent criminal circle that thinks nicknames like that still sound intimidating in this century. "I want to grab a kid," she told him over a burner phone, her voice raw with panic she hadn't bothered to disguise. "Elena Calloway's daughter. 2 million, and you keep 20% of whatever I collect on top." He laughed at her, low and ugly, static crackling on the line. "Calloway, as in the Calloway family that runs half the executive protection contracts on the East Coast? You've got a death wish, lady." "She left with nothing," Vanessa insisted, her voice climbing toward something unhinged. "She doesn't have protection anymore. Not really. Not like before." She was wrong about that, the way she had been wrong about almost everything. She had simply never bothered to understand who she was actually dealing with, all the way back to the beginning. 2 days later, I sent Sophie with a private medical escort to a routine follow-up appointment for her forehead. 2 unmarked armored SUVs, professional close protection drivers from Nathaniel's firm standard operating procedure for any client family under his contract. Nothing improvised or theatrical about it. On a narrow side street near the clinic, a box truck jackknifed suddenly ahead of the lead vehicle, blocking the road entirely, while 2 vans pulled up from behind to box them in on both sides. "Contact! Contact!" the lead driver radioed, already reaching for the door handle, years of training compressing into half a second. Masked men swarmed both vehicles. One of them detonated a flashbang against the rear window, a professional tool, not some implausible trick pulled from nowhere, and in the 3 seconds of blindness and ringing ears that followed, a gloved hand reached through the shattered glass and tore Sophie out of the second driver's grip. "Ma'am, we lost her," came the transmission, relayed to me by Nathaniel's voice on the phone, and I felt the words land like a physical blow, even secondhand, even filtered through static and distance. I didn't scream. I didn't have the luxury of screaming. I called it in exactly the way I'd been trained to years ago in a life I thought I'd left behind for good. Full physical description, exact time, precise location, direction of travel. Then straight to the FBI's Washington field office, invoking my own status as a federal law enforcement officer to secure an immediate connection to their child abduction rapid deployment team, CARD. The unit built specifically to move at the speed a crisis like this demands with no bureaucratic delay allowed to slow it down. Special Agent Renata Monroe took the call herself, her voice clipped and efficient. "Major Calloway, I need everything you've got, and I need it fast." "You'll have it in 5 minutes," I said, already pulling up the driver's transmitted plate numbers, the time-stamped camera footage, everything my mind could organize under pressure instead of simply falling apart. Falling apart, I told myself, was a luxury reserved for later, if there was a later at all. Within the hour, a joint command post was operating out of Nathaniel's firm's headquarters in Arlington, his protective agents working directly under FBI direction, not as some rogue private army acting outside the law, but as licensed contractors formally deputized for the specific operation exactly the way federal statute allows in genuine emergencies. Grant arrived with a laptop already tracking financial pings from the ransom account Vanessa had specified in her message. Derek fed real-time geolocation data pulled from cell tower triangulation the Bureau had properly authorized through an emergency warrant. My phone buzzed with a video message from an unknown number. I made myself watch every second of it. Sophie, tied loosely to a metal chair in what looked like an abandoned warehouse near the Anacostia waterfront, a rag stuffed carelessly in her mouth, tears streaking silently down her face. Vanessa leaned into frame, her split lips still swollen and dark, a box cutter loose and gleaming in her uninjured hand. "Elena, 2 million, unmarked bills. You bring it alone, or I start cutting." The video ended abruptly. I set the phone down very carefully on the table, because if I had gripped it any harder in that moment, I think it genuinely would have shattered in my palm. "I want to go in," I told Agent Monroe when she arrived in person 20 minutes later. "Not alone," she said, already unrolling a satellite map across the hood of her car, "but close. We need her to see a familiar face to keep this from escalating too fast. You'll be wired the entire time and you will follow my team's lead the instant we give the signal. Are we completely clear on that?" Clear, I said, and meant it with every disciplined fiber I had left. The warehouse smelled of rust and low tide, the wind off the river cutting through broken windows high above. I walked in with an empty duffel bag slung over one shoulder, no weapon visible. Both hands open at my sides, the way you approach any volatile scene when the priority is de-escalation, not confrontation. Vanessa stood on a rusted catwalk above me, Sophie tied to a support beam a few feet from the exposed edge, two of Scarface's men flanking her with sawed-off shotguns that looked on closer inspection. Far less dangerous than their owner's nervous expressions suggested they were actually prepared to use. "Where's the money?" Vanessa's voice cracked with something caught between triumph and outright hysteria. "Let her go first," I said, setting the bag down slowly, unzipping it to show the stacked bills Grant had helped assemble under bureau supervision, die packs, and hidden tracking chips buried carefully among the currency. "You don't give the orders here," Vanessa snapped, pressing the box cutter closer to Sophie's cheek. Sophie whimpered, straining weakly against the ropes, her small chest heaving. I looked up at Vanessa and let every ounce of the hard-won calm I had earned over 6 brutal years show plainly on my face, unhidden for the first time in longer than I could remember. "Vanessa, the biggest mistake you ever made wasn't lying to Marcus for 6 years. It's thinking you could threaten a federal officer's child and simply walk away from it." The instant words left my mouth, the warehouse's high windows shattered inward on cue, and red laser sights bloomed across the catwalk from a dozen different directions. The FBI's hostage rescue team, positioned and quietly coordinated for the last 90 minutes, moving precisely on Agent Monroe's signal. A single suppressed round cracked through the cold air and struck the box cutter clean out of Vanessa's hand, taking the edge of 2 fingers with it. She screamed, high and animal. Tactical operators fast roped down through the broken skylights above, and within seconds the 2 armed men were face down on the catwalk, weapons kicked well out of reach, hands zip-tied behind their backs. I was up the rusted stairs before anyone formally told me to move, cutting Sophie's ropes myself with the small folding knife I still carried out of old habit, the one Nathaniel had given me before my first deployment. She sobbed into my shoulder, small and shaking, and, most importantly, entirely alive. "You're safe," I told her over and over, until I half believed I was saying it to steady myself as much as her. Below us, Agent Monroe read Vanessa her rights over her shrieking protests: kidnapping, extortion, embezzlement, evidence tampering in connection with a domestic violence case, the real charges filed by real federal agents under real jurisdiction. With no improvised justice required, no gray area for a defense attorney to exploit later. That was when the black Bentley crashed through the warehouse's chain-link perimeter fence outside. Marcus stumbled out of the car, shirt untucked, hands visibly shaking, having tracked Vanessa's phone using an old GPS locator he'd hidden in her bag months earlier out of his own paranoid, controlling jealousy. He froze completely at the sight of the FBI vehicles, the tactical operators moving with practiced efficiency, the daughter he barely recognized clinging to the mother he thought he had fully understood after 6 years of marriage. "Elena," he said, his voice raw and unfamiliar. "What? Who are you?" I set Sophie gently in the arms of a waiting agent and walked toward him, stopping a careful few feet away, close enough to speak, far enough to feel nothing resembling danger. "I told you who I was 6 years ago," I said. "Major Elena Calloway, United States Army, Criminal Investigation Division. You just never once asked me twice." He stared at me as if the words had physically struck him across the face, the same way his hand had once struck mine. Grant stepped up beside me a moment later, his JAG credentials still clipped visibly to his jacket. "Mr. Wade, I'd strongly advise you get a lawyer immediately. Between the federal fraud charges and what just happened here to your former employee, you're going to need one badly." Marcus's knees buckled slowly and he went down hard onto the gravel, both hands pressed against his face. "Ugh, I didn't know," he said, muffled. "I swear to God, I didn't know who you were, not really." "That's the part that should frighten you most," I said, my voice level and unhurried. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me like a human being in the first place, Marcus. You simply chose not to." I pulled from my jacket pocket a small, scorched silver band, the class ring Grant had subpoenaed from an evidence locker after tracing it through Vanessa's own safety deposit records, the engraving of my old unit designation still faintly, stubbornly visible through the tarnish and heat damage. You spent 6 years thanking the wrong person for saving your life, I said and set the ring down deliberately on the gravel in front of him, without ceremony, without cruelty. Simply as a fact laid plainly on the ground between us. I don't need you to believe me. I have the accident report. I have the scar on my own back. I have my daughter, safe, in my arms, right now. That's more than enough for me. I turned and walked back toward the ambulance where paramedics were already checking Sophie over, and I did not look back to see whether he picked the ring up out of the dirt or left it lying there. By that point, it genuinely no longer mattered to me which one he chose. There was one more piece of unfinished business I hadn't forgotten, even in the chaos of those weeks. Grant, on his own initiative, had pulled the incident report from the night of Sophie's birthday. The 11 minutes 2 patrol officers had spent standing in our foyer before telling us to work it out at home, and forwarded it, along with a timeline of the department's fundraising ties to Wade Defense Solutions to the county's Internal Affairs Division. Sheriff Doyle, who had held his post for 16 years and had never once, as far as anyone could find, failed to show up personally for a Wade Defense charity event, was placed on administrative leave pending review within the month. He wasn't charged with a crime. Nothing he'd done technically broke a law, which was, in its own way, the most unsettling part of the whole arrangement. But the county board declined to renew his position that November, and the 2 officers who'd stood in my foyer were both required to complete retraining on mandatory response protocols for domestic violence calls involving children. It wasn't justice in any dramatic sense. It was smaller than that and quieter and, I came to believe, more honest. The slow correction of a system that had briefly and predictably failed a family with the wrong last name to matter. Marcus tried, twice, to see Sophie in the months after Wade Defense collapsed. The first time, he sent a letter through his attorney requesting supervised visitation, which the family court granted conditionally, pending a psychological evaluation he never scheduled. The second time, he simply showed up at my father's gate in Front Royal on a gray December afternoon, unannounced, his coat too thin for the cold, asking the intercom camera over and over to let him in to see his daughter. Nathaniel was the one who walked out to meet him, arms crossed, breath fogging in the cold air. "You don't get to just show up," he said. "There's a process. You know there's a process. You built half your career on knowing exactly how processes work." "I just want to see her," Marcus said, his voice cracking in a way it never had in 6 years of marriage to me. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. She's asked us more than once why you never write back to the letters her therapist suggested she send, Nathaniel said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. When you're ready to actually answer that question honestly in front of a judge with a licensed evaluator in the room, we'll talk about visitation. Until then, this gate isn't the place for it. Marcus stood in the cold for a long moment, looking past Nathaniel toward the lit windows of the house, where Sophie was almost certainly doing homework at the kitchen table, entirely unaware he was standing 50 yards away. Then he turned and walked back to his car without another word. I watched the whole exchange from an upstairs window, and I felt, to my own surprise, something closer to sorrow than satisfaction. Not enough sorrow to change anything. Just enough to remind me that consequences, even fully deserved ones, rarely feel the way you imagine they will from a distance. In the months that followed, the machinery of the country I had sworn to serve did exactly what it was designed to do, slowly and almost entirely without spectacle. Vanessa pled guilty to kidnapping and extortion in exchange for cooperating testimony against Marcus regarding the falsified defense contracts she'd helped quietly conceal for years, and was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. In her formal allocution before the judge, she claimed she had acted partly under implicit pressure from Marcus to keep the company's numbers looking clean, a claim Grant's own evidence made only partially credible, but one that stuck to Marcus's reputation, regardless the way mud clings stubbornly to anyone still standing too close to a collapsing wall. I attended the sentencing hearing, though I hadn't planned to speak, and hadn't been asked to. I sat 3 rows back, Grant beside me in his dress uniform, and listened as Vanessa, thinner now, her hair unstyled for what was probably the first time in years, told the courtroom about growing up on a series of army posts as an enlisted soldier's daughter, watching officers' wives at every duty station treat her mother like household help at unit functions, watching doors that opened easily for other children close quietly and without explanation in front of her own. "I decided a long time ago," she said, her voice flat with something that sounded less like remorse than exhaustion, "that I was never going to be the one standing outside the door again. I just picked the wrong door and I hurt people who didn't deserve it to get there. It wasn't an excuse. The judge said as much before handing down 18 years, and I agreed with him. But it was, I thought, the first true thing I had ever heard her say, and it didn't make me hate her any less. It just made the whole arrangement feel less like a fairy tale with a villain in it, and more like what it actually was. Two women who had both once decided that making themselves smaller or making themselves indispensable to the wrong man was the only available way to matter. We had simply landed on opposite sides of that decision. Marcus was indicted separately on federal fraud charges tied directly to the falsified military certifications. Because he had personally guaranteed the company's expansion debt, a clause his own lawyers had once assured him was little more than a formality, the collapse of Wade Defense Solutions dragged his personal assets down along with it. All of it entirely legal, entirely documented, entirely his own signature at the bottom of every page. The house in McLean was sold at a court-ordered auction within the year. His name eventually became a case study cited in defense industry compliance trainings across the region, not because anyone involved wanted personal revenge on him, but because the government genuinely needed people to understand in concrete terms. What happens when a contractor quietly cuts corners on equipment meant to keep soldiers alive on the other side of the world? I found Carla a new position too through my father's network, a housekeeping role with a retired Army family in Alexandria who, as far as I know, has never once told her to mind her own business when something in the house looked wrong. She called me the week after Marcus's arrest, crying, to apologize for the 11 minutes those officers had stood in our foyer doing nothing, as though any of it had been her fault for calling them at all. "You did the one thing you actually had the power to do," I told her. Nobody else in that house even tried. I don't think she fully believed me. Not that day, but she kept the job. And she still sends Sophie a birthday card every October, always with a drawing of a cake on the front, always intact. I filed for full custody through ordinary family court, and the duress-tainted divorce agreement he'd forced on me in the cellar was thrown out entirely once the judge reviewed the time-stamped security footage Grant had properly subpoenaed. I didn't ask for a single dollar of Marcus's money in the proceedings. I never wanted it. I only ever wanted my name and my daughter's safety returned to me intact, both of which the law, however slowly, however imperfectly, eventually gave back. I thought often in those quiet months about a lesson I hadn't fully understood until I was standing on the other side of it, that boundaries are not the same thing as punishment, and that walking away from someone who has hurt you is not an act of cruelty even when it feels to the person left behind exactly like one. I had spent 6 years believing that love required me to keep absorbing harm indefinitely as proof of how much I was willing to give. What I learned instead, sitting in that cellar with my daughter's blood on my sleeve, was that real love, for myself, for Sophie, even in some complicated way, for the marriage I had once believed in, required me to finally stop. That winter, the CID Training Command asked me to speak to a group of newly commissioned officers about recognizing coercive control in cases that don't look on the surface. Like the textbook version of abuse, the cases where there are no visible bruises for months at a time, only a slow, patient erosion of a person's sense of what they're allowed to want for themselves. I almost said no. Standing in front of a room of sharp, eager lieutenants felt like a strange place to admit how thoroughly I had once talked myself out of trusting my own judgment. The hardest part of my case, I told them, wasn't the night in the cellar. It was the 6 years before it, when nothing had happened yet that anyone would call a crime. And I still knew, somewhere underneath all my own rationalizations, that something was wrong. Trust that instinct in the people you interview. Trust it in yourselves. By the time a case reaches you with visible injuries, the victim has usually already spent a very long time being told by someone that what she's feeling isn't real. A young second lieutenant near the front raised her hand afterward and asked, quietly, how you were supposed to know the difference between ordinary marital compromise and the beginning of something dangerous. I didn't have a clean answer for her. I only told her what I'd eventually learned myself, that compromise leaves you feeling closer to the person you love, and control leaves you feeling smaller, and the two are not supposed to feel anything alike, even when they're dressed up to look the same from the outside. I went back to the Army the following spring. My leave of absence formally ended my personnel file, reviewed and cleared by a promotion board that, as it turned out, had been quietly aware of my work on the Wade defense case for months already. They pinned Lieutenant Colonel rank onto my shoulders in a small ceremony at Fort Belvoir on a bright windless morning, my father standing at rigid attention in the second row in his old dress uniform, eyes suspiciously bright behind his glasses, my three brothers lined up beside him like they'd never once doubted not for a single day that this moment would come. Sophie, 6 years old, now ran across the parade ground the second the ceremony formally ended, her hair wind-blown, a thin pale scar above her eyebrow that had faded almost entirely, barely visible unless you already knew exactly where to look for it. "Mommy, you look like a superhero," she said, tugging excitedly at the new rank insignia on my shoulder. "I'm just a soldier, baby," I said, kneeling to hug her tightly. "Same as I always was. Uncle Nate said you're the toughest one in the whole family." "Don't you dare tell your uncles I agreed with that, but he's right." Sophie started at a small private school that fall one with a counselor on staff who specialized in children who had witnessed household violence, and within a few months her teacher told me gently that she had stopped flinching at raised voices in the hallway, had started raising her own hand in class again, had begun slowly to trust that a loud sound in another room did not automatically mean something terrible was happening to someone she loved. Progress, I learned, rarely announces itself. It simply accumulates quietly, the way trust does, one unremarkable Tuesday at a time. That evening we stood together on the small hill behind my father's property, watching the flag over the house catch the last of the light before sunset, snapping steady and unbothered in the evening wind. My father joined us a few minutes later, still in the cardigan he refused to retire even for a promotion ceremony, and stood on Sophie's other side without saying much of anything, which had always been his way of saying the most important things. "You know," he said eventually, watching the flag settle into its slow rhythm. "In 30 years of service, I told a lot of young officers that courage isn't the absence of fear." I'm not sure I ever fully understood what I meant by that until I watched you walk out of that man's house in the rain with nothing but your daughter in your arms. He cleared his throat, embarrassed by his own sentimentality, in a way that made me love him more, not less. "I'm proud of you, Elena. I don't think I said that enough. Back when you first told us you were leaving him, I'm saying it now. I thought about the version of myself who had spent 6 years believing that love meant making herself invisible, folding herself smaller and smaller until there was almost nothing left to see. And I thought about the version of me standing here now, visible, properly ranked whole, with a daughter who no longer flinched at ordinary sounds in other rooms, and a father standing beside her willing to say out loud what pride actually sounded like. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. I felt something quieter than triumph. And I think, in the end, far more durable. I felt like someone who had finally stopped apologizing for the size of the life she was always meant to hold. "Mommy," Sophie said, leaning her head against my side as the flag settled into its slow, steady rhythm of folding and unfolding above us, "are we going to be okay now?" I put my hand gently on her shoulder and watched the colors move against the darkening sky, unhurried, unafraid, exactly where they belonged. "We already are," I said. "We already are."